Can a wounded dog really become your mirror and show you all the parts of yourself you've tried to forget? Have you ever wondered what keeps a man and an old dog awake at night? What hidden ache makes someone patrol the empty streets long after hope has faded? On a rain-soaked night in a forgotten mountain town, one quiet act of compassion changed 3 lives forever. A trembling German shepherd, a broken leash, a silent promise: stay. As the storm raged outside, something softer began inside. 2 wounded souls, finding each other in the dark, daring to believe that even the most scarred hearts can find their way home. The sun had dropped behind the mountains an hour ago, but the light in these valleys lingers, blue and slow, stretching the last of the day across rooftops and gravel roads. On the outskirts of Marrow Pines, Thomas drove his patrol car down Main Street, the windows half fogged from his own breath. Beside him, in the passenger seat where the radio once sat, Jasper lay curled into himself, chin pressed to a graying paw, eyes half shut, as if even rest was work these days. At this hour, the town shrank into itself. Porch lights blinked on one by one, some windows casting silhouettes. An old woman crossing the kitchen in a housecoat. The distant shape of a teenage boy slumped over a blue glow, a television's flicker. There was no one on the sidewalks, not since the cold set in last week. Only the faint thud of rain on metal and the hush that comes before the next thing breaks. Thomas kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting over Jasper's broad back. The German shepherd's fur was not as thick as it had been, thinned by age and the old wounds that never fully closed. His breathing had a soft wheeze now, barely audible over the quiet hum of tires rolling through wet leaves. Thomas's own body echoed this soft unraveling. He felt it in the ache along his left knee, in the heaviness in his chest that never quite left, not even on the good days. They made their rounds along familiar streets, past the shuttered diner, the rusted swings at Lincoln Park, the faded mural along the train station wall. The routine had not changed in years, though the world seemed to keep slipping further away with each turn. Thomas felt the gap growing between himself and the life he once knew, when his boy was small, waiting at home with a picture book and a mismatched sock, the kitchen filled with light and the sharp smell of oranges. But his son was grown now, living 2 states east, voice always polite but always brief, each text message carrying the weight of all that was unsaid. Sometimes Thomas imagined the boy as he was, wide-eyed, trusting, grabbing his sleeve in the supermarket aisles, and wondered when, exactly, that grip had loosened. He could not recall a single argument, a slammed door, or a night spent waiting for the sound of keys in the lock. Instead, there had been the gentle erosion of closeness, as if the river that ran behind their house had gradually washed the ground from beneath their feet. Now, most nights, it was just him and Jasper, carving out their routines in the echo chamber of old habit. The station house felt colder in the evenings. Sometimes after shift, Thomas would stand in the dark kitchen, thumb tracing the worn handle of his mug, listening to the house settle around him. Jasper's nails clicking across the tile, the shuffle of paws circling a patch of worn linoleum before sleep. There was a comfort in the sameness, a kind of truce. Neither man nor dog demanded more than the other could give. Jasper had stopped waiting for long walks. Thomas had stopped reaching for the phone, dialing numbers that rang and rang into silence. They lived inside a quiet pact, to keep each other company, to ask nothing more. Tonight, as the rain thickened, Thomas found himself slowing at every intersection. He watched the world through the watery lens of the windshield, the scattered glow of headlights, a pair of cats huddled under a dumpster, a paper coffee cup spinning along the gutter. He noticed things he might have missed before, the way the rain turned the road silver, how Jasper's ears flickered at each distant clap of thunder, how his own heart tightened and loosened with each passing mile. At a red light, Thomas rolled the window down a crack. Let the scent of wet earth and pine drift in. Jasper lifted his head, sniffed the air, then let it out in a long, resigned sigh. The sound was so human, it caught Thomas off guard. For a moment, he remembered a time when he trusted more freely, when the world seemed full of people worth knowing, when dogs were simply pets, not companions against loneliness. He glanced at Jasper, saw in his tired eyes the mirror of his own reluctance, the old wariness that came from being left too many times. There was a grace in the way Jasper endured, never complaining, never asking for more than a soft word, a hand on his back. Thomas envied that capacity, that silent loyalty. He wondered if either of them would ever again trust enough to ask for something as fragile as kindness. The cruiser rolled on, headlights sweeping over fence posts, rain-spattered mailboxes, the hush of yards where nothing stirred. Thomas kept the radio low, the static filling the car with its own form of conversation. Somewhere down the block, a porch light flicked off, plunging another patch of road into darkness. He thought of his own father, long dead, the way the old man would sit on the porch after supper, dog at his feet, both of them watching the road as if expecting someone to come home. Thomas remembered never asking what the man waited for, never knowing how many times a person could be disappointed and still keep waiting. At the next corner, he braked without meaning to. Jasper raised his head, ears pricked, as if sensing a shift in the world outside. For a heartbeat, Thomas let his hand rest on the old dog's shoulder. The warmth beneath his palm, the steady pulse of life. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Not for trouble, not for the call of duty, but for that hush at the center of all longing. The pause before the next chapter begins, and so they drove on. Two tired souls in a rain-dark town, neither one sure if they still belonged to the world, or only to each other. But for now, that was enough. The silence between them, the steady beating of Jasper's heart, and the slow, reluctant hope that maybe, just maybe, somewhere ahead, there was something left to find. The rain sharpened after midnight, rattling against the windshield with a percussive insistence that seemed to erase even memory. Streetlights along the old logging road blurred in the downpour, casting rings of uncertain gold onto the cracked blacktop. Thomas slowed as he turned onto Willow Street, an irony he registered with the kind of weary amusement reserved for people long past the age of believing in signs. Jasper shifted in the passenger seat, the stiffness in his movements more pronounced in weather like this. The damp seemed to reach right through the glass, into bone and muscle, making everything slower, heavier. Thomas glanced at the dog, and then back at the wavering road ahead. Sometimes, he thought, storms only revealed what was always there, roads pitted, houses sagging, lives gone a little soft at the edges. On a night like this, calls were rare. The world huddled indoors, lights behind drawn curtains, the town folding in on itself. It was the kind of weather that made everyone a little more cautious, a little more careful about what or who they let in. Thomas almost missed it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the sodium haze, something low and indistinct near a telephone pole where the road bent sharply toward the creek. At first, he thought it was a sack of trash or a branch torn loose by the wind. But as he approached, the cruiser's headlights illuminated a shape, fragile and still, pressed against the battered boards of a half-collapsed fence. He braked, easing the car to the shoulder. Jasper's head rose, ears tense, nose twitching, as if reading some ancient signal in the air. Thomas killed the engine and sat for a moment, rain thrumming above. He reached for the old yellow slicker on the seat behind him, the fabric cold and faintly musty with the scent of dog and damp wool. Stepping out, he was struck by the force of the rain, the kind that soaks through everything in seconds, plastering hair to skin, seeping under collars, turning the world to water and shadow. His boots squelched in the mud as he approached the fence. The shape huddled there did not move, did not cower or flee. It was a dog, smaller than Jasper, her fur flattened against a frame both young and battered. She was tethered to the fence with an old rope, frayed and shocked, tied with a knot that suggested more anger than skill. Her coat, though thick, was slick with water and filth. She shivered, but otherwise did not react as Thomas approached. He crouched, keeping his movements deliberate, every gesture slow and measured. The streetlight behind them cast their shadows against the fence, man and dog, and something small and silent, barely there. He could see her eyes, dark and unblinking, watching him with an exhausted wariness he knew too well. Behind him, Jasper waited in the open door of the cruiser, unmoving. Rain gathered in runnels along his muzzle and dripped from his grizzled brow, but he did not bark. He watched the scene with the same measured patience as Thomas, two old souls recognizing something familiar in the broken and the abandoned. Thomas's hands were steady as he reached for the rope, his fingers numb with cold. The knot was tight, but he worked it loose without force. The dog flinched only once, a twitch of muscle along her side, a memory rather than a protest. He slipped the rope free and let it fall to the ground. For a long moment, the three of them stood in the rain. Thomas, dripping and silent, the new dog, later to be called Willow, still crouched, and Jasper, bearing witness from the car, his posture neither tense nor welcoming, simply present. Willow did not run. She did not whimper. She only shivered, as if unsure whether this was reprieve or just another pause before pain. Thomas offered his palm, open and empty. The rain softened his scent, and for a second, Willow's nose twitched in the direction of his hand. She took a single step forward, not out of trust, but from the exhaustion of indecision. He waited. No sudden movement, no soothing words. Just the quiet permission to exist, to not be forced. Behind him, Jasper stepped down from the car with a grunt, his paws landing in a puddle that splashed up along his chest. He walked slowly, approaching the pair with the steady gravity of an animal who has learned the world's sharpness and no longer needs to prove anything. He stopped beside Thomas, stood for a moment nose to nose with Willow. They exchanged no sound, no snap, no obvious dominance. Jasper simply stood, then eased his weight to his haunches and sat, turning his face toward the rain. In that instant, Thomas sensed something pass between them, a silent agreement forged not from hope, but from resignation. Willow's trembling eased just slightly. She blinked, let out a slow breath, and settled into the mud at his feet. Thomas did not rush. He slid the old slicker from his own shoulders, draped it over Willow's back. The fabric clung to her, holding some measure of warmth. He stroked her side once, gently, feeling beneath the fur the familiar ridges of ribs, the pattern of old scars. He did not count them. Jasper shook himself, water spraying from his coat, and looked at Thomas as if to say, "This one stays." Thomas nodded, as if there was ever a question. He lifted Willow, careful with her weight, feeling her stiffen, then go still. He carried her to the car and set her gently on the back seat. Jasper climbed in beside her, lying lengthwise so that their bodies shared the narrow warmth. Willow pressed herself against him, hesitant at first, then with a kind of desperate relief. Thomas shut the door, stood for a moment beneath the streetlight, letting the rain soak through him. He watched the silhouettes inside the car, Jasper's broad back, Willow's small, battered frame curled against him. The storm hammered the roof, but within the car, a fragile silence formed. He got in, started the engine, and turned toward the station. The windshield wipers beat out a slow, steady rhythm. The town slid past, blurred by water and the hush that follows rescue. No one on the streets, no eyes in the windows, just a man and his dogs, carrying home what the world had left behind. And somewhere in the quiet of his heart, Thomas felt the smallest shift, the beginnings of a new kind of trust. Not hope, not yet, but the willingness to stay, to keep showing up, even in the rain. By the time Thomas pulled into the lot behind the police station, the rain had faded to a thin, lingering drizzle. Overhead, the lights above the back door buzzed quietly, painting circles on the slick pavement. The world felt wrung out, soaked, subdued, expectant. For a moment, Thomas simply sat behind the wheel, hands resting loosely at 10 and 2, listening to the slow, uneven breathing of the two dogs behind him. Inside, the station's halls were nearly empty. Most nights, after storms, even the youngest deputies left early. Tonight there were only a few cars scattered in the lot, their windshields beaded with rain, hoods steaming faintly in the cooling air. Thomas nudged the driver's door open, felt the air on his face. Cleaner now, heavy with the scent of wet pine and old concrete. He circled to the back seat. Jasper shifted upright, watching him, while Willow huddled at the far end, pressed so tightly into the corner that she seemed to disappear against the shadows. Thomas moved slow, hands open, his posture easy, as if not to startle a creature half lost between worlds. He reached in, scooping Willow into his arms. She didn't struggle, but he could feel the tension in her limbs, the twitch beneath her skin, the uncertain balance between collapse and resistance. Inside, the lights were low. There was a hush in the station that made it feel more like a chapel than a place of duty. Linoleum floors glistening, chairs tucked neatly beneath battered tables, the faint hum of an old soda machine somewhere down the hall. Jasper trotted ahead, pausing every few steps to look back, making sure Willow and Thomas were close behind. The kennel room was off the break area, a narrow space lined with chain-link stalls and thick rubber mats. There was no other dog tonight. The room held a sleepy warmth from the baseboard heater, its metal cover rattling faintly as it cycled on and off. The scent of bleach and old fur lingered under everything, a comfort. In its way, a sign that animals had passed through here and, mostly, moved on. Thomas set Willow down near the old cast-iron stove. She stood for a moment, unsteady, sides heaving with the exhaustion that came after fear. Her eyes flicked to every corner, charting escape routes even as her body sagged, spent. Jasper watched her, his own body angled sideways, not blocking the door, not encroaching. There was a patience in him that Thomas recognized from years of watching veterans share rooms with the newly wounded. The instinct to give space, to speak in silence. He set out 2 old blankets, folded and smelling faintly of cedar and something else. Perhaps memory. Willow crept to the nearest, curled tight, nose tucked into her flank, every line of her body drawn in. Thomas, moving through his rituals, filled the water bowl, poured a modest scoop of kibble, set both within reach but not too close. He moved the space heater nearer, checked the thermostat, adjusted it so the room was warm but not stifling. Everything was a gesture, a promise that no harm would come, at least for now. Jasper nosed around the perimeter, then settled a few feet away, lying sphinx-like, forepaws crossed, head on the mat. The dogs faced one another, Willow still shivering, Jasper breathing deep, slow, letting the calm in his body travel outward. Thomas watched them, felt the longing and the weariness that seemed to radiate off both animals, different shapes of the same ache. He stepped into the adjoining kitchenette, set water on to boil for tea. 2 mugs, a remnant habit, though he never finished both anymore. On the counter, he placed 1 cup beside his own, the other near the doorway to the kennel. Once this was for his son, a memory of quiet evenings, the small pleasure of routine. Now the gesture felt like an offering, to the silent, the wounded, those who needed presence more than conversation. In the gentle light of the lamp, Thomas eased into the old armchair near the door. He did not try to coax, did not call, did not reach. Instead, he sat with hands resting, eyes half closed, letting his breathing find the slow rhythm that Jasper had already learned. The air was thick with that fragile peace which arrives only after a storm. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the huff of the heater, the soft crunch of Jasper shifting his weight, the nearly imperceptible tremor of Willow's breath. At some point, she lifted her head and watched the man sitting in the armchair, watched Jasper, watched the space around her, her ears flicking at every sound, her eyes darting but never quite settling. Jasper, patient, blinked slow and steady. He yawned, jaw wide, then curled more tightly on his mat, the tip of his tail just visible beneath the folds of blanket. He was not guarding, he was not teaching, he was simply being a presence, a companion, an answer to a question never voiced. Willow, after an age, let her muscles ease, her head droop lower. She did not sleep, but she no longer watched the door. Her body, for the first time in perhaps days, was allowed the possibility of rest. Thomas set the mug beside her. He did not force closeness, did not press. He watched the 2 dogs, and through the haze of exhaustion felt a small easing in himself, a slackening of that ancient knot between fear and hope. Later, as the hour stretched on, Thomas doused the last lights, leaving only the lamp on the desk and the orange glow of the heater. In the darkness, he listened to the dogs breathing, the room wrapped in a quiet that felt different than the loneliness before. It was a silence built of presence, of sharing space with another creature carrying wounds you could not see but somehow understood. He lingered in the chair, mug cooling on the table, eyes heavy, memories washing up and receding like slow waves. Beyond the window, the rain had stopped. The only movement was the steam curling from his cup, the occasional twitch of Jasper's ear, the tiny sighs Willow let out as she drifted, by degrees, closer to sleep. Somewhere in the night, Thomas too allowed himself to let go, to rest without vigilance, if only for a little while. And in that small room, nothing special, nothing grand, 3 souls found themselves no longer quite so lost, no longer entirely alone. The hours between midnight and dawn move differently in a police station. There are no sudden alarms, no heavy boots in the hallway, only the slow tick of a battered clock and the hush of the old heater clicking on and off. In that liminal space, time dilates, becomes soft at the edges, filled with the smallest things that matter most. Willow did not sleep, not really, even as she lay curled on the blanket near the heater, muscles slackened by warmth. Her eyes flickered open at every sound. Her breathing came in shallow spurts, ears pricking at each shift of shadow. She seemed to exist in the tense space between fleeing and collapse, as if at any moment she might vanish or shatter. Jasper, too, was restless in his own way, but it was a restlessness born of patience, not fear. Now and then, he would lift his head, nose the air, adjust his position on the mat. He would stretch his forelegs forward, then tuck them back in, letting his tail thump softly once against the rubber mat. But mostly, he remained where he was, visible, available, never demanding. He did not watch Willow directly. His gaze always seemed to settle just beside her, as if to grant her the privacy to settle, to heal at her own pace. From the chair in the darkened room, Thomas noticed these things: the cautious tilt of Willow's head, the steadying presence of Jasper's slow, deliberate breath. He knew enough about wounds, his own, others, to recognize that trust could not be summoned by kindness alone. It needed time, space, the absence of threat. It needed to be chosen. The rain outside faded into a faint drip from the eaves. Every so often, a gust of wind would rattle the back door or send the loose screen against the window with a hollow pop. In those moments, Willow would tense, her whole body quivering, but she did not run or bark. Instead, she would look, first at Thomas, then at Jasper, then at the wall behind her, as if seeking confirmation that this place, this night, was truly safe. Toward dawn, the room filled with a pale gray light, not quite sunrise, but enough to see the subtle changes that come with morning. Thomas stood, his back stiff, his mind floating between memory and the present. He moved through the small rituals of waking, rinsing his face at the sink, refilling the kettle, folding the wool blanket that had slipped from his shoulders. In the kennel, Jasper stretched, jaw cracking in a slow yawn. He eased himself upright, wandered over to the water bowl, drank, then padded back. But instead of returning to his original spot, he circled closer to Willow. He settled with a heavy exhale, letting his flank nearly touch hers, just enough to be felt, not enough to threaten. Willow watched him. For a time, nothing changed. Then, as if carried by instinct more than courage, she shifted too, inch by inch, until her nose grazed the rough fur of Jasper's leg. She let her head rest there, the smallest point of contact. It was not surrender, not dependence, but a gesture born of exhaustion, a silent request for permission to stay. Jasper did not move away. He accepted the weight of her head, as one accepts the weight of sorrow, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. His eyes closed again, his breathing slow and regular, the pulse of his presence radiating calm. Thomas, returning with his mug, saw the two dogs in this new formation, Willow anchored by Jasper, Jasper softened by Willow's touch. He felt a pulse of hope so faint it almost hurt, the realization that healing could begin in the absence of words, that two creatures so marked by being left might find comfort simply in not leaving. He made no sound to mark the moment. Instead, he sat again in his chair, sipped at his tea, watched the room change with the growing light. He let himself recall the last time he had seen such a gesture. The summer his son broke his arm falling from the hayloft, and Jasper, then still young and wild, had pressed close to the boy's cast, resting his head there until the pain subsided, until the child fell asleep. It had not been the touch that mattered, but the permission to be vulnerable, to ask nothing but presence. Hours slipped by this way, measured not by events, but by the gradual softening of bodies, by the way Willow's shivering quieted, by the slow deepening of Jasper's sleep. The sun crept up behind the mountain, painting faint stripes of gold along the station walls. At one point, Willow startled awake from a dream, eyes wide, breath shallow, but instead of recoiling, she found Jasper's side beside her and pressed in closer, seeking reassurance in warmth rather than escape. Thomas saw the tremor run through her, saw it subside. He said nothing, did nothing, only watched and waited, his own hands relaxed in his lap. Later, when the morning was fully bright, Jasper rose and stretched, shook himself and walked to the door, tail low but moving. Willow followed, slowly at first, then with more certainty, her paws making soft imprints on the tile. She stopped once to look back at Thomas, her eyes uncertain but no longer wild. He nodded, just once, and she continued after Jasper. The world outside the station had been washed clean. The storm had left puddles in the parking lot, the sky bright with the kind of blue that only comes after long rain. As the dog stepped into the corridor, Thomas followed, a little lighter than the night before. In the space they had made together, without words, there was now the beginning of a truce, a fragile peace born of patience, presence, and the smallest gestures of trust. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas believed, not in the quick fix of forgiveness or forgetting, but in the slow, hard-won grace of staying, of choosing, again and again, not to leave. The rain had washed most of the night's residue from the world, but inside the station, the hush of early morning clung to everything. In the kennel room, soft gold seeped through the windows, laying stripes across the tiled floor and Jasper's back. Willow was still, curled into herself, but her eyes tracked the slant of sun, the dust motes, the steady movement of Jasper as he eased through his morning routine. Jasper moved with the care of age. He stretched slowly, his joints cracking in the quiet, then padded around the room, sniffing the corners, checking the doors as if confirming nothing in the world had changed overnight. There was no hurry in him. He paused beside Willow, sniffed her side once, then wandered to the water bowl. She watched his every movement with a kind of wary attention. Not quite fear, more the caution of one who has learned to live on alert. Thomas entered quietly, closing the door with a gentle click, not wanting to shatter the silence. He carried 2 bowls, one for Jasper, one for Willow, and set them down with care, each in a patch of sun. The air in the room was cool but gentle, the electric heater still humming softly. Willow made no move for food. She only watched as Jasper ambled over, dipped his nose into his bowl, and ate without fuss. Eventually, Willow inched closer, still low to the ground, muscles coiled. She paused just shy of the bowl, nostrils flaring as she took in the scent of breakfast, of Jasper, of the man standing just a few paces off, arms folded, posture quiet. Hunger tugged at her, but something older held her back. She glanced at Jasper, found him chewing, unbothered. That seemed to reassure her, and she took a tentative bite. It was in these plain, unremarkable moments that Thomas saw what hurt often hides. He noticed, as Willow leaned toward her bowl, the fur along her legs was uneven, broken by pale lines that caught the light. There were places, just above her right paw, along her ribs, at the bend of her haunch, where skin had been scraped, hair had not quite grown back. Not the marks of play, but the long, narrow lines of being bound, held too tightly, too long. The scars told a story that was older than this night, older than her arrival at the fence. Thomas squatted down at a respectful distance, watching her from the corner of his eye. Not confronting, not cataloging, just seeing. His chest tightened in recognition. There was no wound quite like the kind that stays after someone's hands have gone, when the pain is less about injury than about memory. He thought of the way he still ran his thumb along the scar on his own wrist, how it would ache in the cold, years after the accident that no one else remembered. Jasper finished his food, circled twice, then flopped down in a spill of sunlight, tongue lolling. He was not a young dog anymore, but he kept a steady, reassuring watch. Willow, after eating, retreated to her blanket by the heater, lying with her back to the room, her head turned just enough to keep the others in view. Thomas busied himself with quiet tasks, topping off water bowls, folding the extra blankets, checking the window locks. Each movement was an act of patience. He resisted the urge to draw close, to stroke the rough fur, to speak gentle words. He had learned, the hard way, that even kindness can feel like pressure when the heart isn't ready. When he'd finished his chores, Thomas settled on the floor a few feet from Willow, not facing her, but instead gazing out the window at the wet morning. He sipped his coffee, slow, watching condensation bead and run. He let his own thoughts drift, memories of childhood pets, of quiet afternoons with his father, of the distance that had grown between him and his son, wide and cold as a river after rain. Sometimes wounds linger not because of violence, but because of the ache of absence, of being left with nothing but the echo of hope. A long moment passed. Then Jasper, as if on cue, ambled over to Willow's blanket and lay beside her, nose a few inches from her flank. He did not press in, did not demand closeness, but after a while he let his tail curl so the tip just touched her paw. Willow stiffened, then exhaled, the breath long and shaky. Her ears twitched. She did not move away. Thomas caught this in his periphery, his heart lifting just a fraction. These were the moments that mattered, the small, nearly invisible gestures of acceptance, of two creatures deciding, in their own silent language, that scars could be shared. There was no healing in a single act, but in the slow, daily repetition of safety. He remembered a winter, years ago, when Jasper had come home from surgery, stitched and raw, unable to climb stairs. Thomas's son had been 12, thin and grave, still unguarded with his care. The boy would sit on the floor for hours, back against Jasper's flank, reading aloud until the dog's trembling stilled, until the hurt became memory, and memory became trust. Healing, Thomas realized, was not the erasing of pain, but the gentle, persistent invitation to begin again. Willow shifted at last, turning so her back pressed lightly against Jasper's. Her eyes drifted closed, muzzle on her paws, the line of her body relaxing in increments. Jasper closed his eyes too, breathing slow and deep, and in that rhythm, Willow's breathing found its own steady pace. Thomas finished his coffee, set the mug on the windowsill, and sat with his knees pulled to his chest, silent witness to their truce. The room filled with the quiet music of dog breaths, the soft click of nails on tile, the hum of the old heater. Outside, the sun climbed higher, breaking the gray, and in that small circle of warmth, 3 souls, each marked in their own way, found that scars, though never truly gone, can soften. That presence, more than words, is the first and last balm for wounds left behind. Late morning sunlight crept through the narrow window, painting a slow-moving river of gold across the station's battered floor tiles. In the quiet, Thomas busied himself with small, familiar tasks, refilling Jasper's water bowl, setting out a clean towel, checking the message slip on his desk that, as always, held nothing urgent. Each movement was careful, his body tuned to silence, not so much avoiding the dogs as making space for them. Jasper and Willow slept in the kennel, close but not touching, their sides rising and falling with the same slow rhythm. At first glance, they might have seemed like a pair long accustomed to each other's presence, but underneath that quiet arrangement was something new, something unsteady and precious, like the first roots sent down after a fire. Thomas let the morning unfold at its own pace. He was in no hurry. Years of loss had taught him that nothing is gained by forcing a bloom before its time. The station's old wall clock ticked along, marking moments that would have gone unnoticed anywhere else. He thought of his son, wondered what he might be doing right now. There was a photograph tucked behind a pile of paperwork on Thomas's desk. His boy at 10, one arm wrapped shyly around Jasper's puppy shoulders, both of them squinting against the sun. It had been the last summer before everything shifted. Since then, their lives had spread apart like pages fluttering in a restless wind. Not from anger, but from the slow, invisible drift that carries even the closest hearts out of reach. Thomas carried these memories like stones in his pocket, never heavy enough to halt him, never light enough to forget. He felt their weight now, as he paused at the doorway and looked in on the dogs. Willow slept more soundly than she had before, pressed against Jasper's flank, a single paw stretched out and twitching with dreams. Her face was softer in sleep. The pinched look of anxiety faded into a gentler expression. Yet, even in rest, Thomas could see the traces of her past, the faint, shiny lines on her legs, the wary tension in her jaw. He understood those marks. His own scars ran deeper than the skin. They lived in the way he hesitated before knocking on his son's door, the way his heart thudded with hope and dread each time a new message chimed on his phone. There was no one to blame, not really. Sometimes love was a thing that slipped through your fingers no matter how hard you tried to hold on. Willow stirred, eyes blinking open, nose testing the air. She seemed to catch Thomas's scent, and for a moment, their gazes met across the room. In her eyes, he saw the old, cold doubt. Will you stay? Will you hurt me if I trust you? He did not look away. He did not step closer. He simply offered his presence, steady as sunlight on stone. Jasper rose with a heavy grunt, shook out his coat, then padded over to the patch of floor just inside the doorway. He sat, back straight, as if standing guard, not over the station, but over this small sanctuary they had built together. He watched Willow with the calm patience of one who has survived storms and learned, at last, not to flinch. For a long while, the three of them inhabited a gentle quiet. Thomas puttered around the office, sorting old forms, wiping down the countertop. Willow watched every movement, not out of fear, but with the cautious hope of the newly reprieved. Sometimes she would shift her weight, as if caught between wanting to follow and wanting to stay invisible. Eventually, Jasper lay down near the door, chin on his paws, his back to Thomas. Willow, left alone in the center of the room, hesitated. Her eyes tracked Jasper, then flicked to Thomas, searching for permission or instruction. There was none. So she moved slowly across the sunlit tiles. Each step was deliberate, as if testing the floor for hidden dangers. When she reached Jasper, she circled once, then twice, before finally settling at his side, shoulder to shoulder, her breathing sinking to his. Thomas caught his own reflection in the window, saw the lines etched deeper since last winter, the stoop of his shoulders, the way his hands hung at his sides, capable, gentle, tired. He recognized something in Willow's movement that echoed in himself. That effort, always, to be close without asking too much. To risk a little more each time, because solitude, however safe, is never truly warm. The afternoon wore on. Jasper dozed. Willow watched the dust floating in the shafts of light. Thomas sat at his desk, reading the same sentence in his report over and over, letting the sound of the dog's breathing fill the spaces left by loneliness. Outside, children's laughter briefly pierced the hush as a pair of neighborhood kids dashed past the station window, their shouts quickly swallowed by distance. Thomas smiled at the memory of his boy's voice, high and bright, calling Jasper to chase a stick through the yard. How many years ago was that? It didn't matter. The memory lived here now, in the faint scent of old fur, in the sight of two dogs sharing space, neither alone, neither demanding. Late in the afternoon, Willow stood and stretched, her body arching long and slow. She padded over to the water bowl, drank deeply, then licked her lips and turned to Thomas. She did not cower, did not shrink away as he approached to refresh her water. She stood her ground, tail held low but not tucked, eyes steady. He bent, poured water, his movements slow and unthreatening. She watched him, not quite ready to touch, but ready to witness. Jasper returned to her side, pressing his nose into her shoulder, a small gesture, a benediction. Thomas watched, quiet and grateful, feeling the echo of that touch in his own chest. For now, that was enough. Three beings, each marked by absence, had found a moment's refuge in shared stillness. It was not yet healing, not yet trust, but it was the beginning of belonging, not in words, but in the silent agreement to stay, to keep trying, even when every scar says it might be easier to leave. By late afternoon, the storm that had scrubbed the world clean left behind a sky scraped clear and a stillness that felt almost sacred. The light outside turned the mountain ridges a shade of blue that could never be caught in photographs, the kind that lingered at the edge of memory long after the day had ended. Inside the station, there was a hush as well, a pause between heartbeats, a space made for waiting. Thomas stood by the back door, mug cradled in his hands, feeling the coolness of the porcelain against his palms. His gaze traveled beyond the lot, to where the rain had pooled in the low spots, making mirrors out of old gravel and broken pavement. He could see his own reflection, blurred and shifting beside the shadow of the building, and behind him, Jasper and Willow, framed in the doorway, as if uncertain whether to enter the wider world. He opened the door wide, not with ceremony but as an invitation, letting the soft air sweep in. Jasper stepped forward first, cautious but steady, his tail giving a slow wag as he trotted out onto the small patch of grass behind the station. Willow hung back, her body taut, ears flicked to the side in uncertainty. The threshold was a boundary of more than just space. It was a border between the known and the possible, between being protected and risking something new. Thomas did not call her. He did not urge her forward. He simply waited, presence alone his offer of faith. Jasper paused midway across the grass, turned to look over his shoulder. He waited too, gaze patient, tail wagging again, smaller this time, as if encouraging but never commanding. For a long moment, Willow remained in the doorway, her paws pressed to the mat, body humming with indecision. The world outside was bright, unfamiliar. She took a step back, then forward again. Nose lifted to catch the scent of earth, of wet leaves, of Jasper's musky coat. At last, with the smallest exhale, she stepped onto the threshold and then over it, as if testing whether the ground would hold her. Jasper resumed his gentle, slow walk, finding a patch of sunlight and sitting in it, chin lifted, eyes half closed. Willow crossed the grass in cautious arcs, head low, body never entirely unwound, but curiosity gradually overtaking fear. She sniffed at the puddles, at the tufts of grass flattened by rain, at the air itself. When Jasper lay down, Willow circled him once, twice, then settled a short distance away. Close enough to feel his warmth, not so close as to demand contact. Thomas watched, his heart soft in his chest. This was the key to kindness. He knew. The willingness to let another choose the terms of their own healing. He thought of all the times he'd tried to solve his son's sadness, to fill every silence with comfort, every wound with words. Only later did he realize that sometimes kindness was simply in the waiting, the patience to remain, even in uncertainty. He moved to the old wooden bench beneath the back eaves, the seat still damp from the morning's rain. He sat, resting his mug beside him, hands loose in his lap. He watched Jasper yawn, watched Willow stretch, watched a blue jay flicker down to the far fence post and scold them all with cheerful disregard. No one hurried anyone else. Jasper's contentment became a kind of gravity, anchoring Willow's restless energy. Over the next hour, she inched closer, her body gradually softening, paws spread on the sun-warmed grass, tail relaxing until it drummed once, then stilled. Now and then, Thomas would glance away, letting his focus drift to the trees lining the alley, the glint of a passing car, the way the light fell through the leaves. The world went on, indifferent and enormous. But here in this small square of quiet, something gentle was taking root. At one point, Willow ventured across the yard, her nose leading her to a battered tennis ball left half buried in mud. She sniffed, prodded it with a paw, nudged it again. Jasper watched with sleepy interest, but made no move to claim the prize. Willow nosed the ball across the grass, shy at first, then with growing confidence until it rolled to Jasper's paws. He pressed it lightly with his chin, as if bestowing approval. Willow circled, then settled beside him, the ball wedged between them. A small, shared treasure. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He thought of other afternoons, other creatures who had found their way into his keeping. Lost kittens, orphaned birds, once even a fawn. The pattern was always the same. Fear, patience, the slow, tentative reach toward something warmer, softer, safer. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched across the yard. Willow and Jasper lay side by side now, the ball forgotten, their bodies aligned in parallel lines, breathing in time with the hush of evening. Thomas sat quietly, content just to witness, understanding at last that kindness does not require understanding, only the faith to stay present, to offer space and time. He knew the work was not done. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, old scars reopening in new weather. But today, for these few hours, the world had become possible again. 2 dogs and a man, all marked by absence, all made softer by waiting, by allowing each other to cross the thresholds of their own making, in their own way. In that gentle golden light, with the air washed clean and the station at his back, Thomas felt the smallest glimmer of peace, nothing loud, nothing triumphant, just a quiet knowing that healing, like trust, grows slow and sure in the space where kindness waits. The next morning, a pale gold broke across the town, catching in puddles and striping the cracked parking lot behind the station. Mist clung to the grass, rising in thin, lazy veils that curled around the porch posts and drifted over the old wooden bench. The world felt quieter after the storm, air washed clean, the scent of earth and distant pine a gentle balm. Thomas woke early, not to the clang of the alarm, but to the slow unfolding of light through the blinds. For a long moment, he lay still, listening. Somewhere down the hallway, Jasper's nails clicked across linoleum, a rhythm as familiar as heartbeat. There was a softer sound, too. Willow, lighter, almost tentative, like someone learning to inhabit their own presence. He dressed without hurry, washed his face in the chilly bathroom, and took a minute longer than usual to brush the steam from the mirror. In his reflection, he saw not just age, but softness, the set of his shoulders, less defensive than it had been, the mouth unpressed by lines of worry. He found Jasper and Willow near the back door, waiting in a hush that felt more hopeful than wary. Jasper gave his slow, greeting wag, tail thumping against the floor. Willow stood just behind, eyes bright, body ready to follow. Thomas opened the door and let in the cool breath of morning. The yard was still damp from the night, but the grass felt lush underfoot, threaded with dew. Jasper stepped outside, shook himself vigorously, sending droplets flying in a small arc of sunlight. Willow hesitated only a moment before trailing after him, paws sinking into the softened ground. Thomas sat on the edge of the porch, coffee warming his hands, content to watch the slow choreography. Jasper sniffed along the fence, checked the corners, his routine unchanged. Willow followed his path, but now there was curiosity in her gait, her nose tracing not just fear but wonder, finding in each corner a new scent to decipher. She paused at the battered patch of marigolds, sniffed at a muddy clump, then startled as a moth burst from the leaves. She stepped back, startled, then pressed forward again, tail quivering. Jasper approached, stood beside her, and lowered his nose to the flowers. Willow watched him, then copied, inhaling deep. It was a simple thing, but Thomas felt his chest tighten. He recognized in her mimicry the first buds of trust, a willingness to learn, to explore, not alone but together. The changes came in increments, not grand gestures, but the smallest shifts of comfort. Willow began to eat closer to Jasper, her shoulders no longer hunched in defense. She lingered longer in the open doorway, blinking into the light, until one day she was the first to step outside, nudging the screen with her nose before anyone else had risen. Inside, Thomas tended to the routines of care. He fixed the loose boards in the fence, swept puddles from the walk, and on a whim planted a few new flower starts, something bright for the far end of the yard. He repaired the gate latch, the one that always clanged in the wind, and as he worked, Jasper watched from the grass, Willow nearby, their bodies forming a quiet, patient audience. Some afternoons, Thomas found himself sitting on the back steps with both dogs pressed in close, their warmth a comfort that needed no translation. He noticed how Willow, once content to sleep at the edge of the room, now chose a spot near Jasper, their sides touching. If he brushed her flank as he passed, she did not flinch, sometimes even leaning into the hand, just for a moment. Her scars, once stark against her fur, seemed less prominent now, faded into the ordinary map of her body, no longer the first thing anyone saw. It wasn't perfection. There were days when Willow startled at sudden noises, when old reflexes sent her scurrying to the farthest corner, trembling with memory. But even then, Jasper would find her, lying nearby, a silent reassurance that no one was left to endure fear alone, and Thomas, kneeling on the cold tile, would rest a hand nearby, never forcing, only offering. Willow began to greet the world with small acts of courage, investigating a fallen branch, sniffing a visitor's shoes, letting the local mailman offer a tentative treat through the fence. She learned the music of the house, the slam of the back door, the kettle's whistle, the distant drone of the radio in Thomas's office, and found in it a rhythm that slowly became her own. Jasper's pace slowed, but his gentleness remained. He watched Willow's exploration with mild approval, sometimes joining, sometimes simply basking in the sun, content to bear witness to her awakening. One afternoon, as Thomas weeded beneath the kitchen window, he looked up to see Willow perched at the threshold, head cocked, watching him work. Jasper stood behind her, their outlines framed by the door, side by side in the light. Thomas raised a hand. Willow stepped out, crossed the small stretch of earth and nosed at his sleeve. He let her, feeling the damp warmth of her breath, the faint quiver of her trust. There was no applause, no proclamation, just the hush of late day, the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the sound of three beings, each carrying their own silent histories, finding, at last, a way to remain. In those small, shared mornings and quiet afternoons, the house and yard became less a shelter and more a home. No one demanded healing or hurry or proof. In every small gesture, every slow wag, every careful touch, every silent, waiting pause, was the patient, lasting work of learning to belong. It was late October when the first real cold crept in. The grass dulled beneath a veil of frost, and the wind, no longer scented with rain, carried the sharpness of approaching winter. By then, routines had become almost sacred. The slow waking, the yard rituals, the silent companionship that threaded through each hour of the day. But even the softest rhythms are interrupted. One morning, as Thomas stepped outside to let the dogs into the yard, he noticed Jasper hesitate at the threshold. The old shepherd's breath steamed in the chill air, coming faster than usual. He eased his way onto the porch and paused, his body hunched, every movement a little slower, a little less certain. Willow noticed before Thomas did. She stopped halfway across the yard and turned, ears forward, her entire body attentive. Thomas watched as Jasper made his way to the patch of sunlight, lowered himself to the ground with a groan, and lay very still, eyes half closed. Inside, Thomas settled Jasper on a thick blanket near the back door, the one spot that always caught the warmth of the afternoon sun. The old dog's breaths came shallow now, his sides moving with the delicate, measured rhythm of someone holding on. Willow hovered nearby, restless, pacing the tile with small, anxious steps, as if searching for something she might do. Thomas sat on the floor, knees drawn up, one hand resting gently on Jasper's shoulder, the other extended, palm open, offering comfort without words. He felt the familiar ache, loss rising in his chest, the past pressing close. He remembered, with a sudden clarity, the way his own father had sat in silence beside him when his childhood dog passed. Neither of them saying much, both understanding that grief could be shared, not solved. Willow circled Jasper, finally lying down at his back, so close their fur mingled. She stretched her head forward, resting it just behind his ears, her breath stirring the hair on his neck. Jasper shifted, just enough to let his body rest against hers, the contact as gentle as a benediction. For a long while, the only sound was the hush of their breathing, the faint tick of the clock above the stove. Thomas let his hand move between them, palm flat, feeling the warmth where their bodies met. It struck him how far they had come from the night of the storm, from the tight coil of distrust and fear. Now, in this moment, there was no hesitation, no doubt about belonging. Grief still hovered, as it always does when love is old and the world is cold. But it was tempered by the knowledge that no one here would be left to bear it alone. The afternoon passed in increments, shadows moving across the floor, the furnace humming to life, Willow never straying more than a breath away. She licked Jasper's muzzle, tentative at first, then with slow certainty, as if learning the ritual of comfort. Jasper responded not with words, but with presence, the soft rumble of his chest, the weight of his body offered as a place of rest. Outside, the sky turned pewter, and Thomas pulled another blanket over Jasper. Willow pressed closer, curling around him in a quiet arc of protection. Thomas watched the two of them, feeling something in himself yield, not to sadness, but to gratitude for the way connection had grown, fragile at first, now strong enough to hold even the weight of parting. He thought of his son then, wondered if somewhere far away, he was sitting by a window with his own dog at his feet. Thomas reached for his phone, typed out a message. Nothing elaborate, just, "Jasper's slowing down, thinking of you today." He stared at the screen, then set it aside, content to let the thought hang unspoken in the air. As darkness fell, the house filled with the gentle hush of acceptance. Thomas, Willow, and Jasper remained together, sharing a silence made holy by its honesty. No one spoke. There was no need. Even pain, when witnessed and shared, could be something softer, a shape that fit into the contours of love. In the last light of day, Willow lifted her head and pressed it into Jasper's side. She closed her eyes, her breathing deepening, her entire body relaxing, as if, at last, she had found not just a place but a reason to stay. Thomas reached out, laid his hand over both dogs, feeling the slow, steady beat of Jasper's heart, the lighter flutter of Willow's beside it. There was no drama in the moment, no miracle of healing, only the miracle of endurance, of the choice to remain when it would be easier to withdraw. Jasper's eyes fluttered open, his gaze landing on Thomas, then Willow, then drifting closed again, content. Outside, the first snowflakes drifted past the window, swirling in the porch light. Each one unique, each one melting on the warm ground. Inside, 3 lives, bound by absence, by old wounds and silent hopes, rested in the quiet certainty that this too was love, not in grand gestures or loud declarations, but in the patient willingness to stay, to hold space for sorrow and for joy, and to trust that even as the world turned, nothing truly good was ever lost. The days after Jasper's weakness arrived in a hush, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The world outside wore the color of November, fields gone tawny, air bright and cold, every sound traveling a little farther across the empty yards and bare branches. In this quiet, time unspooled slowly. Each morning Thomas rose early, wrapped in an old sweater, and paused at the back window, watching for the first flicker of sun over the fence posts. Jasper, though frailer, still greeted each dawn with a gentle dignity. He stood when he could, moved with care, and always looked for Willow first, his eyes soft and sure. Willow had become his shadow in these days, never more than a breath away, alert to every shift in his breathing, every attempt he made to stand, to walk, to linger at the open door. She slept curled against his side, a sentinel and a friend, her own healing finally, fully entwined with his. The house was quieter, yes, but it was a new kind of quiet. Not the brittle hush of absence, but a hush born of presence, of 3 beings learning to hold steady in the face of the unknown. Thomas, too, found himself changed. His movements slowed, his voice gentler, his impatience faded by the daily work of caring, preparing Jasper's meals softer, brushing his coat with slower strokes, finding Willow's eyes in the early hours, and seeing in them not just uncertainty, but a new kind of trust. Afternoons slipped by in ritual. Thomas sat on the steps of the back porch, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, watching Willow and Jasper move through the slanting light. Sometimes Jasper would doze on the patch of grass near the porch, Willow lying beside him, the two of them breathing in unison. At other times, Willow would nudge Jasper to his feet, and they would shuffle across the yard. Jasper's steps tentative, Willow pausing for him, glancing over her shoulder with quiet patience. Thomas never hurried them. He watched and learned from the slow choreography, the silent agreements, the way Willow adapted her pace, the way Jasper let himself lean even just a little. There was dignity in this gentleness. There was a lesson in it, too, that love, given freely and without demand, can soften even the hardest places, can invite us to remain, even as seasons turn. As November deepened, the town prepared for winter in the usual ways. Neighbors raked leaves into piles at the curb. The school bus passed each morning, children's laughter muffled by scarves. Thomas felt the world contracting, drawing inward. But he did not feel alone. The house, which once echoed with loss, now hummed with the quiet certainty of belonging. Sometimes, in the blue hour before dinner, Thomas would receive a message from his son, short, but warmer than before. "How's the old man?" Or, "Saw a shepherd at the park. Thought of you guys." These notes carried no fanfare, no resolution, but they did not need to. Thomas answered simply, honestly. "We're still here. It's getting cold." Willow won't leave Jasper's side. On the mildest days, all three sat on the porch together. Thomas on the top step, Jasper at his feet, Willow pressed against Jasper's flank. No one spoke. The soundscape was built of small things, wind moving through empty trees, the creak of the porch swing, the distant call of a jay in the field beyond the fence. In these moments, Thomas understood what it meant to let healing be slow, to allow grief and gratitude to sit side by side, neither one rushing the other away. Some evenings, as rain traced lines down the window, Willow would rest her head on Jasper's back, and Thomas would rest his palm on both of them, feeling the warmth, the steady pulse, the simple fact of their togetherness. He no longer needed to explain himself to the empty rooms or to the ghosts of regret. The house was full in its own quiet way. As winter's first real storm approached, Thomas reinforced the windows, checked the generator, laid extra blankets on the beds. He moved with confidence, certain now that whatever came, they would weather it together. On the last day before the snow, Thomas received another message from his son. "Dad, you good? Want to come visit after the holidays?" Thomas smiled, felt the old ache recede, replaced by something warmer. He typed his reply, "We're still here. Doors always open." He set the phone aside and turned to the window, where Jasper and Willow watched the first flakes drift down, silent and weightless. As the dusk settled, Thomas stepped onto the porch. He looked out over the yard, bare, waiting, but still alive. Willow and Jasper sat together on the grass, shoulder to shoulder, their breath making small clouds in the fading light. Thomas joined them, lowering himself beside his old friend, Willow shifting to make space. For a long time they sat like that, three figures outlined against the coming dark, not talking, not needing to. In the hush that follows real healing, the world felt wide and merciful. The future, uncertain as it was, no longer felt like something to fear. The simple act of staying, of not leaving, had transformed them all. Even the porch, battered by years of storms, felt sturdy beneath them. In that gentle, unremarkable twilight, Thomas realized there would always be things unfinished, words unsaid, scars that never quite disappeared. But there would also always be this: a place to belong, a reason to remain, a warm body leaning into yours, silent but sure. And so the night gathered them in, the house behind and the wide world ahead, while snow fell softly over all the wounds that once had seemed so permanent. Inside and out, everything was, at last, enough. Maybe healing doesn't come all at once. Maybe it's the quiet promise to stay, the small, stubborn act of sitting beside another soul as night falls and the world grows cold. In this place, on a porch marked by years and storms, a man, a weary shepherd, and a once-lost dog learned that home isn't a destination. It's the daily choice to remain, to offer warmth without asking for anything in return, to share silence as gently as you'd share a prayer. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, I hope you'll share a memory, a lesson, or simply the name of a dog who taught you how to trust again. Sometimes it's our quiet stories, our scars and second chances that reach further than we know. Thank you for being here, for reading to the end, and for believing, even for a moment, that kindness can mend what time could not.